Hello.
Hi, friend. How are you?
I'm all right.
Took absolutely no cyber law classes. They just didn't exist back then. So it was a whole new area that broke out. But what happened was in my military career, I crossed over some people who needed operational lawyers. That's what I did for a living. And one of them happened to start having a requirement that they needed somebody to know something about outer space. And I had known this gentleman from working for him in Desert Storm. And he said, Doug, can you come figure out if I need an operational lawyer for space? Which started an amazing path for me to go do something all about the future every day being different. And I got to do that and got mobilized by the Army after 9/11 to work on these law issues and policy issues at the senior level for the whole US government. I was an Army reservist who basically took over Air Force space war games, and then dealt with policy for the intelligence community and DoD. And so I have a pretty unique background that comes at it, that not only were we users of space, but we were at the time still creating law and policy and got to shape and mold both US responses, national law, US law, versus, by the way, some of the international law that appears on what we're doing. And then finally, kind of the culmination of my career was I wrote the first rules of engagement for outer space for the United States military, which is essentially, I see Rachel joining, which was essentially the writing the laws of warfare in space for the United States government. And I will say that I wrote them so we don't go to war in space. And that was my plan when I was working on it, to make it difficult because we don't need more war in space. But I got to do that for a number of years, and then finally retired and left with all those requirements. But I ended up at Raytheon. We built space sensors. They go on satellites, and they're launched by companies like SpaceX. And Rachel's with us now, so I'll let her introduction come in.
Great. Hi, folks, and sorry for the delay in my joining. A little technical difficulties there.
That was my fault. That was totally my fault. Everybody, it was not Rachel's fault. I want you all to know that. That was on my end. So, Rachel, I apologize, and we're so happy to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thanks
no
for
worries
joining us.
No worries. So I think I'm supposed to give an introduction now, from what I understand. So
Yeah, that would be great. We're just asking, to give a little bit of information about your background and really your journey to SpaceX before we get into what you do at SpaceX, but just talking about your journey there first.
Yeah, no problem at all. So again, my name is Rachel Lovejoy. I currently work at SpaceX, and I've been there for about 6 years. How did I get there is an interesting question. I'm not a space lawyer per se. I actually cut my teeth in Silicon Valley in the sort of late 90s in various technology-related things. I'm a tech transactions lawyer by background. I spent about 11 years at IBM in places like San Francisco, New York, Dubai, and Sao Paulo, doing various technology-related deals and handling all kinds of issues. I had a friend who was at SpaceX, and he kept trying to convince me that I should join this crazy startup, that they needed somebody with my background. And it took a little while, but I eventually accepted an offer there. And do a host of things there, which we'll talk about in a minute. So that's the sort of background of how I got into SpaceX.
Okay, great. So going back to Doug, can you touched on this already a little bit, but can you tell us a little bit about Raytheon's place in the space industry? What is its mission, and how do you as a lawyer help further that mission?
Maybe it'll help if I try to give you a little bifurcation of how the industry sets up in kind of a variable spaces. There's components of space. First you go, well, you got to get to space. That's SpaceX. That's one of the companies that does that. Launch is the most important thing. You don't get to space without being in space. Outer space without going through SpaceX. Then once you get up there, there's stuff called on orbit, and that'll matter what you put up there. There's obviously people going to space, astronauts as well as tourists that are going through that, but we also have all sorts of satellites that go up there. Satellites are known by the type of payloads they typically carry. Comm satellites, communication satellites, there'll be weather satellites, there'll be intelligence satellites, things that collect data. There's all sorts of that, but those are some typical ones. And then most importantly, because if you can't communicate with it, it's called junk, space junk. is that there's actually a ground component to space. And in fact, I'll back up for a moment. We're all in space right now. You're just on the terrestrial sphere. We're orbiting the sun. We're going around. We're all in space. We're just Terrans. Terrans compared to astronauts. Someday there'll be lunar nauts, people who are actually on the moon. There'll be Martians that will put people out on Mars if that's the plan. And as we go through this, we have it. Now I'll back up. Once you get the launch built and somebody gets something in space, they put a sensor on that. If it's not humans, and we're going to space stations, those sensors are lots of different things. The ship going through space, the spacecraft is called a bus, typically, because it carries lots of passengers. And one of the sensors the types of sensors Raytheon builds is all the weather satellites for the military right now. They're building the weather satellites that NOAA uses, and they're out there. They make incredible images. And as the technology gets better, digital, it's gotten better and better. We also build some comms type satellites, but we build a lot of sensors, things that have mirrors that reflect light that we collect and share. So we can do that both for a weather satellite as well as an intelligence satellite that will do other things. So there's both the military world called national security space, and then for the US government, and then there's civilian things that people want those imagery satellites to go build stuff. For example, if you've gone and seen an image, originally it was called Digital Globe. That company is now owned by Maxar, and they build imagery satellites that take pictures of the Earth that are wonderful. And we get to see the globe from outer space like the astronauts do. Those things are great. We are help building the next generation of those imagers on board somebody else's spacecraft.
Great. And so how do you as a lawyer fit in then with what Raytheon is doing? How do you help further that mission?
So given what I used to do, which was play war games to pretend we're blowing up things in space, which is very exciting, but we didn't actually blow anything up. Just want to let you know, is that in fact, what I do now is basically help get contracts from the different people who want to put things in space to make them work. So as a lawyer, I make sure the contracts are aligned with what we're trying to do, then how we execute those programs. So the interesting part is I get to participate with people who are thinking about the next generation, what the sensors will be, where they'll go, how they'll be built, whether we can do the images, because that'll be decided by the government. But if the government says, I want a particular imagery ability with better focus capabilities, so they'll see smaller things in more detail, we just have to get permission to build it, and we go out and build it. So we stay in compliance with the laws. But I think what you'll find is I'm essentially a general counsel. I deal with all the human issues, all the things that lawyers typically deal with the patina that our product is going to go to space.
Okay. So Rachel, I'll ask you the same question. Tell me a little bit about how SpaceX fits into the space industry, about its mission, and how you help achieve its goals.
Sure. So SpaceX's stated mission basically is to make humans a multi-planetary species, so to speak. So Doug just talked about a couple of the aspects of the space industry. First, launch. So SpaceX now is a very successful launch provider. We launch basically other companies or other governments' payloads, usually satellites, up into various orbits around the globe. We are also moving into developing our own satellite constellation for broadband internet at a global level. So that is in process, and we hope to be rolling that out later this year. There's a third component that Doug did not mention, though, which is sending humans into space, which is a very important part of our goal as well. And in fact, on May 27th, we are scheduled to launch NASA astronauts to the International Space Station, and we'll be the first private company to be able to do that, which we're super, super excited about. And learning how to do that and do it successfully is obviously an important part of our goal. Now, what do I as a lawyer do to support this goal? Well, I have to admit, I do pretty what I would call mundane legal tasks and activities and advice, for a very exciting company that's doing exciting things. So the things that I help manage are intellectual property, so patents, trademarks, trade secrets, confidentiality, data security, and things like that, as well as manage all of our real estate assets. So we have, sites in various locations supporting our launch activities, our satellite activities, And you know, I do a lot of sort of traditional tech transactions as well, whether it's software licenses or hardware purchases and things like that. So to say I'm a space lawyer is a bit of a misnomer in the sense that I don't deal with, you know, treaties or big international law issues like Doug might deal with. And I don't work on the policy side of things for SpaceX. We have another team that does that. But I do help SpaceX to navigate what I would call both mundane, but also in some respects cutting edge issues as we're heading into this sort of new space era.
Cool. So let me go back to you then, Doug. We had talked before about just the evolution of the space industry and about space law and regulations and how it's moved from being a government venture into this more commercial world. So I want to ask you to just talk a little bit about that evolution of space law and space industry and just that foundation, since you were such a key part of that. And then we can talk more about how it plays out today.
I don't call myself key. I assume there's somebody on this webinar who works at NASA. Those are the key players, and they have to be recognized as such. I'll back you up, though, because I had to teach this over and over to many, many people throughout the government who said, I don't need any of that fancy space stuff. I just need the weather satellite, the weather channel, and my GPS. I'm good. Without realizing, yeah, those two things work. And I need access to the ATM so I can get stuff. Not realizing that's also tied to satellites. Our world is all tied to satellites now, is essentially where we are. But what I think is the most interesting part about this is the law isn't old. We're still in the brand new early era of this. And I played a big role for a number of years in some small capacity, but I got to shape a few things. But let me back up, because there's lots of law on space. But it tend to be treaty-based, and it started to set some ground rules that I call playground rules people going to space would have to comply with. So 1957 is obviously the most important date in space. It's the date that Sputnik went up, October 4th, 1957. What's incredibly interesting about that, though, is 10 years later, almost every country on Earth was willing to sign something called the Outer Space Treaty. 10 years to get the whole world to agree with some general principles about what we do in space. Those principles guide almost all of our national policy. We may tweak the definitions on what we're doing, but those are the laws that are out there. But there's things like the Rescue and Return Agreement. There's a liability convention to figure out who's liable for launch versus something that's on orbit. There's all of these things that keep happening. But what the first presumption was, and Eisenhower saw it, he didn't want to expand the world into a competitive environment militarily. And I'll back up. Eisenhower did a genius move. He knew that every satellite, because of science, has to go around the Earth. It orbits. So he didn't declare that we had a right to control everything up into space. He said, no, we're not going to shoot down and say you violated our airspace because you flew over us, because we're going to have to do the same thing. And he then took an organization called NACA, the National Aviation Civil Administration, and he changed that to NASA. And NASA became a civilian organization responsible for managing space for the benefit of all mankind. That was not a military organization. Interestingly, the first Gemini astronauts were all military members. And the policies went from there. The whole thought was no one in 1967 ever saw anybody having the wealth or capability except a nation to go to space. And over time, that has changed. All of a sudden, not even that many years later, there were on-orbit satellites built by private organizations that wanted them launched. They went through Lockheed Martin and Boeing here. Today, we buy rocket boosters from over Russia for a long time. Those haven't been permitted. Creates all sorts of avenues as the law and tariffs go into place. But ultimately, we've gotten to a place where the capabilities were just not being invested in by the US government, and NASA was going to lose the space shuttle. And all of a sudden, some very creative geniuses came up and said, we can do launch faster. Launch is the trick to get into space. And some people came up with that idea, and they went with it. And that created a whole new opportunity for people throughout the world to start thinking about space a little bit differently, not just competitively, but as a commercial enterprise. And so now we have Virgin Galactic, SpaceX, obviously, rock and roll stars. They're doing amazing things. And if you don't take pride, Rachel, I'm like thinking about you. in the fact that they did those launches with landings of their boosters. I mean, that was just so cool. It's just amazing. But we went through this process, and more commercial players are out there saying, this is where the world's going. I want to be out there on the front edge of it. And it's changing it because all the laws that were in place were written for nations. Treaties were binding them. We thought of the actors as being just nations. And today, we're changing that. We're going to privately held satellites up in space. The sensors that are flying around are owned by a company, not by a government. How does that all work together, and how does it play out? It's not something the companies worry about, except when they have to indemnify the government. Mm. But they do have to think about it because, and I'll give an example really quickly. When you launch, the nation states have to control where you launch from. And one of the things that they always were concerned about is I have to comply with all these stupid environmental regulations. So they try to move somewhere else. And one of the great ideas at one point was to launch from international waters. No nation state would be controlling you. So we had actual offshore launches. The whole thought process is, where do I go? How can I launch? And we move the launch sites around the world to get compliance with what we want to. It's an interesting process. I don't want to bury it too deep in detail, but it's changed. The world has changed completely in the 50 plus years since the Outer Space Treaty was signed.
Doug, how much of space law is based on maritime law? I think we all know those lines from The Martian where Mark Watley talks about being a pirate. So how much of space law is rooted in maritime law?
The same amount that maritime law is based on land law. There's always connections. It has to make sense to people. Outer space law is based on a couple presumptions. One, that the only people that we have to abide by are the people on Earth. So to presuppose that you'll ask a question, Shauna, I don't know what we'll do with the aliens when they get here, but there is that concern. It's about Earth people, but there is components of international law that relate directly to maritime law, but there's parts that don't. It's really interesting. I'm going to take you deep into an issue that seems a little different, but when I wrote the rules of engagement, the hardest part that we had to get our head around was so many of these satellites they're not human beings on it. If there's a ship that breaks free in the ocean and is called an unchained ship or a ghost ship, and they float and it's coming toward your ship, and you're a battleship, you can destroy that ship so your ship doesn't get hurt. It's not a violation of war. It's not an act of war. It's just protection. But if you were to blow up an unmanned thing in space, everybody believes that, in fact, we'd have an act of war. And the question comes down to, how many selves are in space? Today, there's some on the International Space Station. A couple more days, on May 27th, there's going to be a couple more going up on a new platform, which is very exciting. Those are the selves that are in space, but we've flipped our mindset that artificial intelligence gathering capabilities are now selves in space, and that we can defend them. And it's a little different. So it's not always the same. And we think of those things as very sensitive, and they're important to give us advance warning of nuclear attack, for example. So it plays out a little differently. It's there. It's not completely the same.
And Rachel, you were saying, despite the fact that you work with a space company and people tend to focus on the space side of it, before it can be a space company, it's a terrestrial company, right? So it still has all of the things that every other company has to deal with, plus the extra issues dealing with space. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like some of the terrestrial issues that you deal with that may or may not have any implications directly on what's happening in space, but still need to be taken care of for companies, not just SpaceX, but companies in general, to be able to operate, to do what they're trying to do.
Sure. So in order for us to be successful in space someday, we have to be successful on the ground here on Earth, right? And so just like any company, especially here in the US, you have to abide by certain laws with regard to, say, employment, right? So labor and employment, we have to make sure we're treating our employees appropriately according to the law. We have to make sure that our finance system is run appropriately. We have to make sure we're abiding by environmental laws. There's a whole host of things that are not space specific that SpaceX has to abide by. So, it's not all sort of sexy issues about what you can do in space. And the sort of next step for us as we move further toward our goal of multiplanetary species is then to figure out, okay, we know what the law is if you're a US company sitting here on the US and the sort of things that every company has to do, but what are you going to do in space? What are the rules going to be? What are the laws going to be? How do you figure out what those are going to be? And we don't have to worry about that exactly in this moment, but we do have to start thinking about our compliance efforts on the ground and then how they will transition. We're not even exactly sure of what questions to ask at this point about space, but we've gotten pretty good about figuring out the questions and the answers here on Earth.
So Rachel, sticking with you for a minute. So how forward-looking does the private sector have to be in thinking about, laws and compliance and all of this from, not just complying where the laws are today, but trying to anticipate where it's going to be in 5 years. And of course, technology changes so quickly, but just that 5-year horizon, that 25-year horizon, I mean, the investments that companies and governments make in their space technology and space programs is so huge that it must be a topic of conversation of how to make sure that over time, these investments are protected and that people are getting the greatest value that they can from them. So what are some of the conversations that happen on the private sector?
Sure. So, there's this interesting matrix that happens within SpaceX and probably Raytheon and other companies as well, where, you have the lawyers on the ground like me, in the weeds dealing with day-to-day issues. We work closely in hand with our government affairs team, our lobbyists, to use a dirty word, right, in certain aspects, to talk about not only where the law is today, but where we think the law should be going forward, because there are some issues actively at play in Congress, say right now, or even on the international scale. And then we also work with the business to figure out, okay, what's the business goal, and how does the current law fit in with the business goal, and what changes do we want to see made to then fit the business goal? So if you want to make humans multiplanetary, you need to think about ownership rights when you get to Mars, real estate law when you get to Mars. Mm-hmm. If you invent something cool, who's going to own the intellectual property if you do it on Mars, right? These type of things. So, we're not quite there yet in terms of developing new laws for Mars, but what we are currently trying to do is make sure that the US and international laws that we all have to work under won't stand in the way of achieving a goal in a rational and meaningful way.
Okay. So Deb, we had talked once about some of these just long-term thought processes, right, of what is going to happen. And this is what Rachel was alluding to like down the road, there's a lot of space junk out there. There's a lot of debris. So you have questions of, we haven't had major accidents yet, but as you have more and more players in space, you will have more likelihood for some catastrophic accident. And so what are the rules now about liability for those sorts of things?
So 1973, I'm just looking at my notes. I have to pull it up. I know it's called the Liability Convention. I just have to check the year. 1973. So 6 years after we signed the Outer Space Treaty, the world signs the Liability Convention. Mm-hmm. And it really interesting for lawyers, presents two dichotomies of what the law are. And I think it's kind of illustrative that they could get it. One, this is such a dangerous thing to launch things in space. We've seen too many explosions on the pad, starting with the earliest rockets that wouldn't go up for the United States, to having early astronauts on board and they burned and died, to the Challenger accidents, explosions. It's just, if you haven't seen a rocket launch, it's the loudest thing in the world and it's the fastest thing in the world. To get into orbit, they have to go 17,500 miles an hour. That's orbital velocity. Yeah, there's physics involved here too. Where you launch from matters, but they're loud and everything else. But when you go through this, they have an accident. The point is we all knew it was dangerous. There's something called strict liability. So whoever launches has strict liability, which means, because it's a host nation problem, the United States is liable for that launch if it's their satellite or their rocket launcher. And companies like SpaceX or whoever else is launching, Boeing, Lockheed, the groups that do these together, those things come together and they indemnify. There's actually space insurance, an entire launch protocol about buying insurance for launch. The interesting part is what happens when you get to space. And definition of space is still in rough order. Some people call it the von Karman line. Somebody who was at Caltech who said it's 100 kilometers. It's always good to have a nice round number. It's actually not the interface where the bottom of the spacecraft coming back in catches atmosphere and starts to get hot, but it's close enough. So, we're out there, 60 plus kilometers. That's where space is. But when you get into space, all of a sudden you have something called comparative negligence. It's not strict liability, it's comparative negligence. It's a comparative fault basis. What's hard about that is, how do you figure out what that thing was that flies through space that damaged you? And then who put it there? And then what damage did it cause? So I've got an unmanned satellite in space that all of a sudden isn't working. How do I know? What do I have on there? How do I figure it out? The whole process is, on Earth, we can probably figure out because we're just going to point to the person launched. In space, we're supposed to do comparative negligence. I think it's almost a joke a little bit that they'd say that, because if you have to do comparative negligence, a lawyer has to go to space to research it. And of course, that astronaut is not coming back. They're just going to be left. So that's the first good one you can leave behind. But when we go through that process, it's really interesting. I'll back up, because the true danger is the space debris is huge. Space debris destroys things because in the vacuum of space, something going 17,500 miles an hour continues to go 17,500 miles an hour. So when it goes through, one of the best anecdotes I have of this is the astronauts who will explain to you why the space shuttle used to go in face first with the glasses, the windshield looking forward, and they could see where they're going. One of the early recoveries back into Earth, when they were coming back in, is they got a paint chip that went through the windshield, which is about 8 inches thick. They went right through the windshield, right through 2 seats, and into a bulkhead wall behind the passengers. Nobody was hurt. But of course, the entire capsule inside of the space shuttle decompressed. They all have their spacesuits on. A paint chip, about as big as I'm showing there, did all that damage. A screw about this big, which there's a ton of them in space, they're actually tracked if they can see them on our sensors, that could do even more damage. What they did is they put the hard side of the shuttle down so it came in butt backwards. We have to think about that. That screw, they're going to go and try to figure out who did that. And a manned craft, they had a hard time. They couldn't actually figure out whose paint chip it was. But if you think about a satellite that's out there, we think is very important, something that is monitoring whether, let's say, an adversary is going to launch nuclear weapons at us. These are missile warning satellites. Most people consider they're fairly important. When you have those out there, they fail. What caused the failure? How do you figure that out? And if there was an accident from debris, how do you go and prove it, and how do you go through the process? We're not there yet. It'll be a while.
Rachel, keeping with this idea of liability, we're talking about all of these different component parts, the takeoff, the landing, but you also have all of this equipment that needs to be stored, a lot of hazardous materials, chemicals, whether you're storing it prior to launch or whether you're talking about debris after a launch or when the rockets return. I know that you're on the environmental and real estate side a little bit as well. Can you speak to that? Just sort of what industry players are thinking about with, and some of the issues that they have to think about in terms of environmental impact, and land use concerns, hazardous waste, those sorts of things that are associated with the private sector in space industry?
Sure. So let me, in answer your question, also touch on something that Doug just said about liability. And basically, the U.S. government, for a long time has wanted to encourage private entrance into the space industry, right? And so the way that they've set up liability for what they call launch activities is that a company like SpaceX, for every launch, gets insurance up to a certain amount, as basically determined by the Federal Aviation Administration. And then above and beyond that amount, the federal government basically backs us up for any third-party liability. So, for example, we launch off of Cape Canaveral. Heaven forbid a rocket goes awry and hits Disney World, right? Terrible event, lots of people could die, Disney sues,
right?
We would look first to our insurance, which is not an insignificant amount. And then once that is exhausted, then the federal government theoretically would step in to cover the costs caused by this. And this is because it's a scary thought to think that your company on one launch could be shut down forever, right? So the government sort of set that up. And launch activities does include everything that sort of happens around the launch, at the launch site with liquid oxygen, liquid nitrogen. So if, heaven forbid, one of those hazardous materials causes an explosion, you would be covered under this regime. Now, that being said, we still have to comply with certain EPA regulations with regard to storage, right? Those things are there for safety, right? Or those regulations are in place for safety, and it's in our best interest to abide by them, not just for the sake of abiding by the law, but because it promotes safe launches on our site. For the most part, most of our locations, including our launch locations in Florida, California, and now down in southern Texas, are places that are not in, say, a suburban location with a lot of houses right around the launch site, right? They tend to be slightly remote, although there's some activity going on. So we're not worried about, say, oil leaking into the ground onto the next door neighbor's property. So we're not worried about that level of activity. But we do have to comply with all the rules surrounding hazardous material storage, as well as exposure to our employees. We want to protect our employees, and we have to comply with OSHA and all that kind of stuff. So we do have to make sure that we are in compliance with those.
One of the things I find really interesting with space law is just its interaction and with the space industry. It interacts so much with what's going on Earth in ways that people don't necessarily realize, not just because there are all sorts of players like Bangladesh and Panama that are involved in the space industry on some level, but also because there's so much that's happening in space that impacts us on Earth that we take for granted, right? Like all of the different technologies. I know, Doug, you were talking about before, like what happens if a satellite is destroyed or goes offline, and just the implications for our everyday life on Earth. Can you talk about that a little bit?
You want me to start?
Sure.
Okay, so I played these games for years and created really hard scenarios for people to play with. It was a really interesting posture because it was across the government enterprise at the end of my career. It started with just people in uniform and it ended up everyone from the government, everyone from foreign governments to have to think about these issues. If I had to make a bad prediction, if we, and again, I did not want war in space. I follow Eisenhower on that. It's silly to take us up there. And by the way, I should just say to those people who know me, I went to school in ROTC. I stayed in the Army because I realized you can't leave nuclear weapons to idiots. You have to have people who are thinking about these issues and staying involved, because you have to be on the inside to make the rules. But what we did through this whole process is everybody understands their vulnerabilities out there. One, launch. If you have to reconstitute, it's going to be very difficult. So the unique capabilities out there. The one we all rely on every single day, everyone who is on this video chat together is relying on one technology called PNT, Position, Navigation, and Timing. It has multiple variants on it, what kind of satellites they are. You know it as GPS. In Europe, it's called Galileo, GLONASS, Baidu. Those are the different people. The last two is Russian and Chinese. That PNT system is a system that we use to control for your uses every day, just on a basic kind of every human being. It's the system that lets you go to another country, put your ATM card in to a bank ATM machine, and it tells you the balance of your account back in the United States. It's using a satellite link to get there, and it's connected through timing to that satellite link. It's also the thing that makes every credit card register work. Most importantly, the gas station. So that when we're in a COVID time that nobody wants to take cash and you have to use a credit card, those systems are vital for making it work. Also, what the most interesting part about it, though, is it's basically like Sputnik. It's a little transmitter in space that goes beep, 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 and gives you a signal. You have to find those. Your cars are looking for them and finding out where they are. And by the way, your phone doesn't work on this principle because it would be too hot to carry your phone. But the PNT systems, the GPS system, is probably going to be the first target of everybody who's ever going to go to war in space. Because if they take those systems down, pretty soon your medical systems won't work. Your banks won't work. Your water treatment plants won't work. Your bus system won't work. The train systems won't work. Your highway lights won't work. Everything is tied to this system, and you didn't know it. So there's a huge risk that we all depend on every day. We are in space today. The ones and zeros that you have going across a fiber optic line transmit, they go up through space, they come back down. You didn't know it. The people who created the comms lines, AT&T, all the Verizon, whoever you use for spectrum, they all understand this. And so there's all these connections that we have that have people worried and thinking daily about what it means to have that at jeopardy and our livelihood just stop. And so I think I'm comforted by the fact we're thinking about it. I'm not comforted by the fact that I don't know that we've stopped ourselves from saying that's a place that's inviolable. I would love for us to say it's inviolable, but we continue to think that we have to figure out how to use it. I don't disagree with that. But I think this is touching on a point that our systems matter to us in ways you cannot imagine ever working. That cell phone that you have in your hand right now, that's all based on technology that started with NASA. It came through. And the stuff that SpaceX is doing today is changing the world. It will continue to change the world. Every one of these companies is just doing amazing things that are about tomorrow. And they are changing the technologies you look at. Those little headphones you wear, you saw John Glenn wearing that thing years before you got it. Okay, 20 or 30 years before you got it at your desk. But the point is they're out there and these genius engineers are creating it. The question is, will we use it for good or not evil? Again, hopefully the force will be with us.
So let's, before we start taking questions for our attendees, and I see that we already have a bunch of questions coming in, which is wonderful, so keep those coming. I wanted to ask, and maybe we'll start with you, Rachel, on this, is just as we move forward and put humans into more and more humans into space and start to realize these dreams and these missions of both governments and private sector organizations to put more and more people out to space, to colonize space. What are some of the biggest unanswered legal questions that you all are seeing as, for example, you mentioned employees, right? So if we're, in a blockbuster action film and we have all colonized an asteroid, a mineral-rich asteroid, and a company is the one that has landed on that asteroid and claimed it, you start to see different things like, well, what does that mean for their employees? What does that mean for, criminal law application of these? Can you talk about some of those sorts of forward-looking issues in these scenarios that people in the industry are talking about?
Sure. And yeah, I think at a baseline, most of today's sort of legal constructs are based upon the physical location of your company, its operations, whether it's registered in the state of Delaware for a US company or New York or California. And so it's very tied to a physical location that is always within a defined geographic scope and a political definition of what the country or the state or the city is. And so the very first question out of the gate is, if you're doing something on an asteroid, well, which, that doesn't have already an established set of laws, how do you figure out what laws are going to apply, whether it's, say, laws that could apply to your employees like OSHA, right? If you make an unsafe situation for your employees on this asteroid, does OSHA apply? I don't know. Maybe if you could claim that your company is based in California, so U.S. Federal laws apply in that situation. So you've got sort of that construct, and then you've got other issues. For example, if your employees develop a new process for doing X, Y, or Z, that's a new invention and it would be patentable under the US system. Is it patentable under the US system if it wasn't invented here in the US? Or if your employee is actually a citizen of Canada, you get all of these sort of interplays of issues that will need to be worked out. So, or ownership of land, right? So here in the US, we use the common law system, which comes from the old British and English system of law about land ownership. How's that going to work on an asteroid, right? Just because you're there first, does that mean you get to sort of plant your corporate flag, or does it have to be tied to a country and then you can negotiate? So a lot of these things still need to be worked out.
Doug, what about you?
Can I join there? And it might be a question right back to Rachel.
Sure.
I saw this really interesting point. You get something in orbit in outer space and you claim an IP right. It applies blah, blah, blah worldwide. It's not on the world anymore. It's not on Terra.
Yeah.
So are you guys adopting the word universal?
No, we do, and again, it depends. There's all various flavors of who you're dealing with, a vendor, a customer, and that sort of thing. But yeah, certainly with regard to our satellites, right? It's got to be universal. So.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you realized your whole way of seeing the world changed, and it doesn't apply if you're out in deep space and you're transmitting. What does that mean? That legally you have rights that are farther out than that. Your license better apply that you have a right to go out into space and use somebody's property out in space. I don't know if they thought through that, but the real answer is, I get to get more royalties now.
Sure.
You're not right where I said you were going to be. So
Right.
it changes the whole game. It really is interesting. But you were going to ask a question to me. I'm sorry, Ray.
No, I was going to ask you too, some of along the same lines about some of the legal questions that you see that we are going to need to answer as humans colonize space. What are some of the legal issues that you see that we're going to have to figure out?
So the best and worst thing about getting security clearances is you quit getting to hypothesize, because you might know something. And I used to do Buck Rogers things all the time. Well, Buck Rogers, a long time ago. I mean, that's older than we are. It's so old. Nobody knows Buck Rogers. But he did things in space, and they were on television in the 1950s, for crying out loud, in the 60s. Buck Rogers was showing us ways to go. Star Trek's already done things. So I have always used movies to teach law. Mm-hmm. The scenario you're talking about is Armageddon. That's with Bruce Willis flying out to an asteroid to blow it up and die to save his Liv Tyler. Okay, we'll get.
It may not be scientifically accurate, but it is one of my favorites. It's one of my favorite go-to B movies, I will say.
and Total Recall, the Schwarzenegger version versus the later ones. Same idea is that these concepts that go through here, that was Mars owned by a company. And the question is, the company just put its rules down. But I'm going to go to a whole nother place, a location. One of my favorite stories is that when the Outer Space Treaty was signed in 1967, it had impacts on the lunar landing in 1969 with Apollo 11. And one of those was, you cannot claim a lunar body for a country. There's no national appropriation of space. It says national. It doesn't say anything about companies, which is where I think Rachel's sitting on this, and it's really an interesting point. Do you get to put your flag down? So when we went to space, some guy got out there, Neil Armstrong, and gave a speech, all mankind. He didn't claim it for the United States. He claimed it for all mankind. There's a whole lot of stories around there, but here's where he blew it. And then there was protests all over the world. He planted an American flag, right? He planted that American flag, and guess what? The world blew up. Because if you plant a flag, you're claiming it is for your country. If that flag is there in an embassy, that's U.S. territory. You put it on the Capitol building, that's federal property. That flag meant something, and it's really interesting. It just says we have to be very careful in what we do, because we often don't think through the impact of that decision-making process. And then when you deal with a company wanting to make money, which is going to be their issue, they're going to head to space. And I'm going to say that I'm not sure that Total Recall and Armageddon didn't get it wrong. The reason a lot of people want to go to space is because they think the mineral resources are much, much purer, and they could either keep them in space or bring them back to Earth to mine them and actually use them somewhere. So a lot of the companies that we've looked at this have done that. There's also been companies that have petitioned to have licenses to fly and land on the moon, which, by the way, even though you can't claim it, nobody will land on somebody else's landing spot. And so the answer is, if a company goes up there, can they claim it for themselves? Again, they're not prohibited from corporate appropriation. I'm sure they must make them sign something that says maybe we won't do that. But it's an interesting perspective that it will depend on where we're coming from and how we claim it and where we go. If we trust travel through space, no big deal. But I think the point is, and the vision is, we need to put a footprint somewhere else. Those humans in space will start claiming territory, and what will it mean? And we already have laws going out into space. There's recently a banter about whether criminal laws had to apply in space because someone said, and one of the people on the International Space Station currently had violated criminal laws. Turns out the investigation said, no, maybe not. It was the person on Earth. But it's an interesting question. What jurisdiction would apply? That space station is not controlled by the United States, and therefore U.S. law probably wouldn't apply. So how do you get jurisdiction? But it's a good question for lawyers.
So here I'm going to start pulling on some of the questions that we have from attendees. So there's a question about Raytheon and SpaceX and other companies about concerns about intellectual property and espionage, stealing corporate espionage, stealing trade secrets, all of that. And just a question of how concerned is the private sector about that? And what are some of the things that private industry is doing to protect its IP and to hedge against that?
Sure. Oh, go ahead.
No, I said the IP lawyers has to go first.
Sure, and yeah, this is an issue that every space company is interested in. Our technology is important technology. It's very innovative. We obviously have robust programs in place, not just to protect trade secrets, but on the data security side. And we're concerned not just about sort of corporate espionage in the sense of other companies trying to get access to our secrets, but also state actors, and especially state actors that maybe are not so friendly to the United States, trying to get access to our information, because some of it, although for the most part, our work is on the civilian side of space. We do launches for the Air Force and that sort of thing, but our technology could be used for nefarious purposes. And so we do take it very seriously. We work hand in hand with our partners in the national space industry, with the State Department and others, also to try to make sure that we are handling these things in the right way. So that's a big issue. There are actually some industry-wide organizations that also address this, and probably SpaceX and Raytheon are involved in those as well. So that is an important issue.
Espionage, whether it happens in the United States, outside the United States, it happens all the time. We're concerned about people who just want to beat us in the game, American companies. We're concerned about the French beating us in the game, or the Russians beating at the games. And it doesn't have to be for a nefarious purpose. The interesting part about this is, I said it's always about tomorrow. One of the most interesting things about space in my mind, from a lawyering standpoint, is people are bidding to build something today. with technology that doesn't exist today. And when they get done building it and launching it, it will be obsolete. Think about that. The technology is already obsolete because we're requiring it to be nearly perfect when they send these really exquisite level sensors up into space. But comm satellites, they don't want that to go down. It costs them billions of dollars to build those things. They don't want that to, they want that to work, and they want to go to space and work all the time. To have that kind of perfection is a kind of intellectual property. Don't want walking out the door yet. Every single year, there are people arrested by the FBI for leaving the country with secrets in their backpack as they go out and go over there. We advise people constantly, even if you don't have a security clearance, the amount of information you have in your head is exquisite to other people. And we don't want to give that away. This is the sort of thing that keeps jobs in the United States when we need jobs, when we need really good paying jobs. But they're important for the fact that we want to have a better cell phone and a better cell phone connection, so that my fuzzy image here will become a really clear one like Rachel has, because she's got a better computer, and we can afford that. And that becomes because the technology keeps getting developed better. And we just, other people are just as smart as we are. They're looking for really cool ideas. We've got the really cool ideas. We stole them all from Star Trek. Yes, we did. We stole them all from Star Trek.
So Gene Roddenberry had a lot of cool ideas, and Isaac Asimov had a lot of cool ideas, and now we're just getting around to making them a reality.
It's just crazy. I mean, the amount of stuff that I'm sure we're going to have a transporter really soon, because engineers are focused on that. It was in Star Trek. But those guys are all getting old. Somebody else wants something else. We're going to have to go, go light speed. That'll be great when that happens. I don't know if I'll be around. But that technology would be super cool. The concern for people is militarily, but I think from an economic standpoint, it's really, really important, so that those capabilities keep really smart people really involved, because they'll have impacts on our lives that we haven't even thought about yet. By the way, the capability to do this sort of thing, to have classes where kids can sit safely at home and see each other and talk and learn from each other is fabulous. Space, it all comes from space.
So Doug, this might also be for you. We have a number of questions from attendees about basically space wars, right? What are about space wars? Yeah, like what are the rules of engagement for space? What is the role of the UN Security Council in space? How do we prevent wars in space? And who would be patrolling to make sure that wars are not started in space?
Wow. So for the next 6 hours, this is what I taught to all sorts of war colleges and the Air Force and the Navy. I've taught everywhere when I was on active duty, and to be able to go into senior officers' areas and come into them. I was a trial lawyer, was really my experience, which means you teach at the 6th grade level, because they got about this much attention and they have a lot more things they have to think about. The easiest way to think about war in space is we're in space. So when I set this up, cyberspace and outer space were treated very similarly. They thought they were the same thing. In fact, I was part of one of the guys who helped separate them into 2 different areas. So I also have a hand in writing the first cyberspace rules of engagement. They're not the same. But it was interesting to have commanders say, well, someday there will be a war in cyberspace. Dude, there's a war going on now. Everybody's hacking the hell out of each other. It's happening. And by the way, companies were taking down other parties. They were destroying their computers and their links. They knew how to do it. War's happening. Is war happening in space? Yeah, a little bit. It's already going on. We jam each other. We interfere with each other. We go up in space. We put malicious stuff up there that we can. We haven't had shoot downs per se. The Chinese shot down their own satellite to see if they could do it with a rocket. Question is, can they do it with a laser to go up to space? All these things are possible, and they're being built by people. The question is, how do you stop them from using it? I'm going to go back, and I'll come back to how you solve it. The National Security the National Security Council doesn't. The UN's Security Council has no role. Our National Security Council has a role. They play a role in making advice to the president on all the interrelated ways we fight war. We diplomatically deal with it. It's called DIME, diplomatic, informational, military, and gosh, I lost the E. Somebody help me. That's all right. We'll get there. Diplomatic, information. economic, excuse me. And so everybody has a role that we play in the dime. These are the ways we work it. But the military one is the last one. Military is the last thing you want to do. The last thing you have to ever shoot. That's why I hate the acronym of dime. But we're not going to ask permission. Everyone's taken the position that it's self-defense in space, and that's where war will start. We'll have to defend something. It's a vital national interest. The only lesson we have that gets us there, though, is something we know from nuclear war, which is mutually assured destruction. And the answer is, if you destroy mine, I'll destroy yours. I had a fun play in a war game. I set that scenario up. I set that scenario up so that I could teach somebody that we didn't want to do that. The answer was, the bad guys, not a country I can name, it's all classified, had blown up something that we didn't like them to touch. And the person who was very senior, retired in the government, came back, and all these diplomats, all these people from foreign countries were all harumping on the table after he said, we're going to blow them back to the Stone Age in space. And I let the calm die down. And I said, it's really cool. American people will understand that passion. We're never going to do that. And I explained to them, because we didn't have the ability to constitute their health system. We didn't have the ability to run their schools and figure out their economic situation. We wouldn't have comms to talk to them, because we just took out all the things that make comms link. So mutually assured destruction is this concept that if you take mine out, I'll take yours out. The other answer is mutually assured non-destruction. That we have to communicate with each other so that we talk about these problems before they exist. So I helped inspire people to create basically an operations center for the commercial industry that provides services to everybody. And fortunately, they provide information to our hostile adversaries that we don't like so much, Russia, China, obviously. And so that information gets spread. We're not up there trying to do something negative in space. We provide information back and forth to each other. There's no intent to hurt you right now. So we have to get to a point where we communicate that we're not out there going to harm you. We're not going to do something that's dangerous to you. In fact, your Baidu system, China, will continue to operate even if you're attacking our aircraft carrier. Because once we shoot stuff in space, we can't reconstitute it in 15 minutes. And we're going to lose that capability for a long time. And the damage from having something damaged in space will harm all of us and all the other satellites that are in space. So short answer is that's how we do it and how we walk through the process.
So I'm wondering, Rachel, this may be something for you. It alludes to something that you mentioned before when we were giving that example of the asteroid. And also Doug was talking about the planting the flag. So what prevents a company, you were talking about companies being domiciled in Delaware or California or wherever, what prevents them? Is there anything that prevents them from simply saying that their domicile is the moon or orbit or someplace outside, not just state or federal jurisdiction, but outside even earthly jurisdiction?
So, I have to admit that corporate law is not my forte, but, I think in the US, companies will pick a spot that makes sense for them because it is a good place to do business because of the legal structure there, right? So many American companies choose Delaware because there's a well-developed form of laws that already apply there. You know what you're getting into. It's very pro-business. None of that exists on Mars or Asteroid X at this point. So if a company wanted to engage in business with another company, the other company wouldn't know where they stood, and it would create this uncertainty. So, I think there are more sort of practical reasons why companies right now wouldn't do that more than, legally, could I form a company and say I'm formed under the laws of Mars? Yes, but it has no meaning attached to it, if that makes sense. Companies wouldn't know how to do business with me as a company domiciled on Mars, right? So you would have trouble entering into contracts with other companies or individuals. I think
so maybe that's a question that we'll get we'll punt until we get closer to the day when a company does get ready to claim ownership of an asteroid and declare itself, its own nation or an independent body, and having the asteroid as its domicile, and then we'll all be figuring that one out. Okay. So here we have some other questions, some about just sort of careers in general and how one gets into this area. So we have a question about, do you recommend specific experiences or knowledge areas that are of use to space companies? What kind of areas of, for a current law student, what kind of areas of law they should focus on? Questions like that. We have a few questions along those lines for people who are interested in either working in space law proper or working at a company that's operating in the space industry. So maybe Rachel, you can tackle that first.
Sure. So I think there's a couple of different approaches here. And obviously Doug comes from a more sort of, regulatory and policy side of things, whereas I come from the more sort of practical side of things, handling issues that many other companies outside of the space industry also have to grapple with. So I think if you have an interest in space, you can either go the route of, I'm going to learn the regulatory side of things. I'm, maybe there are jobs on Capitol Hill, there are jobs in lobbying organizations, sort of government affairs type jobs that give you more of that flavor. You can go work for NASA, you go work for, join the military, right, as Doug and I actually myself did as well. On the other hand, you could also learn intellectual property law, because I think IP laws are going to be really interesting going forward. And companies always need good lawyers who understand not just the legal substantive aspect of it, but also the business side of their business. And space lawyers always need corporate lawyers. They need lots of other things too. So I think it's really a function of just, figuring out where your interests lie within the broad category of space and space law.
Doug, how about you? What are your thoughts as advice for either attorneys who are already licensed, or law students, or even undergrads who are thinking that they would like to explore this for their careers?
To avoid my imposter syndrome, I'll just claim it right now. I have no idea how I got here. I wrote a letter to my college roommate, who I think is on this call today. And I said to him, when I was dealing with bad debt contracts and pollution that was hundreds of years old, I just want to deal with something was about the future and optimistic and where we're going. Like all of a sudden I got this opportunity. But that being said, let me give you the other thing that matters here. Oh, by the way, that guy's name is Pat Gillis, and we'll just call him out here for a second.
Give him a shout out.
There we go. Give him a shout out, because now I'm going to get shit, but that's okay. The other part about this is, there's no such thing as a legal problem. There's just your problem. I get paid a lot of money to help you with. And so go where the money is, go where the problems are, go to the things that people need help with. And where the money is government contracts. Government pays huge amounts of money for a lot of this. They do certain things. So if you had a government involvement, you can go to work at NASA, a million things. All of NASA is space. Yes, there's still civil aeronautics, but there's also some other things that go on there. And they have all sorts of things to do, but they issue contracts. The Air Force issues contracts for launch and other things that go on. There's space stuff going for all the military branches that go there. But there's international companies do space. There's companies that are overseas and also based in the United States that have all the same contractual domains. It's a client with their normal problems. But I think the other real money places where Rachel lives, which is in IP. The IP thing is going to be huge, and it's going to be very, very important for a longer period of time than we can imagine. And it's still cutting edge. Like, how do I claim things? Where do I work? Because it's where the fights ultimately were going to be. And that's where we'll make our money as lawyers, but also the really complex areas where we can bring our kind of abstract thinking skills to bear. But if you were looking for an education, I was pretty familiar with where all the space law courses were. The best one is in McGill University in Canada. They were really good. The University of Mississippi has something that's pretty good too. But every space lawyer I've ever dealt with, besides the folks who went there, got their chops by just doing it, showing up and saying, hey, what's going on this? What can I help you with? And it's the same answer we give to everything. It's just roll up your sleeves, be willing to learn and make mistakes and go through it. The brilliant part about this, the best thing for me was we're probably past the problem you're already dealing with, and your answer, if good enough, will just be good enough and they'll move on. Because by the time it would be litigated or something else, they're so far past the thinking process that nobody's going to come down hard on you. They're looking for practical answers. And so your practical skills, your common sense are the things they need really, really every day. And so you already have a job that's waiting for you. Go find the places you want to work.
Okay, great, thank you. And I know we're already over the hour we had asked you to reserve, so I will wrap this up for you. Although we did have an attendee ask for 5 additional hours of your time so that we can ask more questions. And
Can we both do a party? I want to do a party, but I want to because I want to call out one of my favorite space dudes. Okay. I love this story because I got to talk to people all the time. This is one of my parting stories, is that how the world doesn't always end up the way you want it to be. The most disgruntled man in the world is Buzz Aldrin. Buzz is still alive. Buzz was the astronaut on the spacecraft who became the second man on the moon. He was the technical officer on that spacecraft. He planned it. He was going to be the first man in space because the technical person is the first one off the spacecraft. In fact, he should have been. About 1967, when the Outer Space Treaty was written, they moved the door. The spacecraft is so small that it can only get in and put one door in. And they moved the door from his side of the spacecraft, everything set up for him to operate, other things for Neil Armstrong to operate, and they moved it to Neil's side. And for years, he has been totally upset because a bunch of lawyers ripped him off from his job of being the first man on the moon. And I just want to apologize to Buzz. I wasn't there. I've never heard the story coming back from the NASA, and it's amazing because I know that NASA lawyers were involved. They had to do a bunch of things, but that one, I always feel like I have to call up Buzz and say, thanks for going up there. I'm sorry you were number 2.
Rachel, do you have a favorite war story that you care to share, or even just telling us what you love most about what you do and where you do it? We'll give you the last word.
Sure. So my very first week on the job at SpaceX, and I didn't know what to expect, but one of the very first issues I had to deal with was a dead cow in New Mexico, where we were doing some work at this spaceport down in New Mexico. One of our guys accidentally hit a cow on the road because it's and I subsequently learned that New Mexico is it's a state that allows cows to roam everywhere. Like, you don't have to put up fences. So unfortunately, we hit a cow and I had to deal with the insurance company about paying. So here I am joining this very sexy, hot startup company, and my first issue was, how to deal with the dead cow in New Mexico. So I've gotten to do a lot more or sexier things, including attend some launches myself, which has been very fun. And I look forward to doing more of that. And with that, I'll just wish everybody a very happy May the 4th, which is obviously a Star Wars reference. So May the 4th be with you. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very, very much for sharing your time with us. This has been really great. And I know we had questions that we weren't able to get to, but I think we could hit most of them during the conversation. So thank you all the attendees for coming and supporting this. This has been really a great talk. Thank you to Jamie for organizing it and taking care of all the logistics. Thank you, Jamie. And again, we do have a LinkedIn page. Our Hopkins Alumni in Law does have a LinkedIn page, and we will include that information so that all our Hopkins community who's interested can join. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Jamie for wrap up.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you. I did have one comment I wanted to share, even though Rachel has left. Seth Jaffe wanted to know if SpaceX got a moving violation for hitting the cow. So
that's great.
Thought that'd be fun to end on.
It's
Seth.
so great.
There you
A lot of
go.
funny
Oh,
comments
I'll
we
ask
didn't get to.
Rachel.
Yes, thank you so much. Please look forward to an email follow-up after this. As always, we want your feedback. We appreciate Doug and Shauna for moderating and Rachel for their great insight and information. And we look forward to seeing you at future events. In the meantime, please stay safe and please join us again as soon as you can, and go hop.
There you go. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.